Okay, I think we've had a few technical issues there, but I think we're ready to go now, and people will be coming to join us. I'd just like to say welcome to everybody. Welcome, colleagues, comrades, ladies, gentlemen, doctors, professors, everybody, to another one in the series of our webinars. This is a long series we've had, which are hosted by the Centre for the Study of International Slavery. And if you're not aware of the work of the Centre, they host a lot of formal lectures, panels, policy launches, film screenings, art exhibitions, many other things, all designed to engage both academic and non-academic audiences. Our seminar series is primarily focusing on the legacies of enslavement in the United States, exploring the cultural and social, political impacts of the slave trade on all societies involved, while fostering interdisciplinary collaborations between scholars internationally. And some of the themes that have been covered and will be covered in the series is the growth of mass imprisonment and policies in the criminal justice system that disproportionately affect African American communities, the legacies of institutions, including universities, which benefited directly from enslaved labour and still benefit from the wealth generated from commodities that were produced through enslavement, and the memorialization and presentation of difficult histories in online and physical repositories. So we cover a lot of ground, covering a long period of history and crossing a lot of disciplinary boundaries, historians, sociologists, and criminologists joining in a conversation about these difficult topics. We continue that theme tonight with a mixed group of contributors, historians, sociologists, and criminologists. I'm going to briefly introduce them. I can't say enough. I'm sure they merit much more, but we want to crack on. So tonight we have Professor Gbemende Johnson from the University of Georgia, Athens, scholar of American politics with a focus on American institutions. And her research interests include executive-judicial interactions, judicial outcomes, and race and politics. We also have from the University of Liverpool, Dr. Jessica White, social and cultural historian of modern Britain. And her research to date has focused on the history of colonial and post-colonial immigration in post-war Britain, women's lives and identities, and politics within that general context. And Dr. David Baker from my department, Sociology, Social Policy and Criminology at the University of Liverpool, whose research focuses on accountability and regulation, specifically in relation to people who die after contact with institutional agencies. So he's conducted a number of research projects on people who have died after contact with the police in the United States, and is currently conducting research into avoidable deaths in relation to mental health care in England and Wales. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to each of our speakers tonight. I'd like to welcome everybody who is going to listen and possibly contribute some questions if we have time at the end. As I say, it's very much conversational format tonight. There's no formal papers, and we hope we can have a lively and interesting discussion. I'm sure we will do. So I'm going to start with asking Gbemende, and then we'll go to Jess and then to Dave, just to give us a little introduction to their own research and how it speaks to the themes of this seminar. Thank you.
I am muted. Sorry. So thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here. So to talk a bit about my research focus, as you mentioned, is American institutions, particularly the interaction between the judiciary and the executive branch. But my research also examines issues of race, gender, and politics. So one strand of my research has examined and currently examines who holds political office and how the public responds to those office holders. So with this, I've examined demographic and environmental factors that affect who we see in positions of power. So that has involved some research on US Congress, but I've also done research examining the composition of the judiciary. And of course, these judges are going to be key decision makers in determining the legality of state action. I've also done some public opinion research looking at how people respond to basically the type of judge making a decision. Is it a male or female judge? And with this co-author research, my co-author and I were asking, will the public sometimes view what's considered a non-traditional judge, like women and people of color used to be called non-traditional judges, will their decisions be viewed as more biased as compared to who's considered a traditional judge? And I also have ongoing research looking at the composition of judiciaries at state, federal, international level. So that's one strand. Another strand involves examining how people feel about race and crime. This particular research focused on how African Americans respond emotionally to interracial crime and intraracial crime. So interracial crime when you have a Black victim and a non-Black perpetrator, and interracial when the victim and the perpetrator are both Black. And with this co-author research, my co-author and I were examining how feelings of anger, shame, fear, and even feelings of punitiveness, how those emerge after being exposed to crime reporting. And our argument here is that the race of the perpetrator and victim, they're going to affect how people will respond because different schemas are being accessed. So, for example, in the aftermath of reading, say if you read a story about a crime involving a Black victim and a non-Black perpetrator, for a Black respondent, this could invoke feelings of anger and frustration, but those feelings may be rooted in historically based violence against African Americans that, stretch back to enslavement, where perpetrators were not necessarily brought to justice. Whereas with feelings of intraracial crime, where it's maybe Black victim, Black perpetrator, this could maybe be more likely to invoke feelings of shame. And both of those, scenarios would involve the state because the juxtaposition of the state in relation to the crime matters. Whereas maybe if it's intraracial crime, you feel that the state has failed to provide communities with resources that they need in terms of economic opportunities and education. Whereas with the interracial dynamic, is the state going to hold the individual who committed the crime responsible? So the idea is looking at this emotional aspect when crime occurs. And I guess I'll wrap up with another strand. I've done some research engaging the Civil War era, particularly the inclusion of the Civil War amendments and how they attempted to reorient and transform the Constitution to at least legally integrate African Americans into society. And of course, the challenges that occurred that have occurred with that effort. So that's some of the research interests that I have that I feel like connect to the themes here.
Fascinating stuff there. Jess, do you want to come in next? Thanks, Gbemende.
Mhm.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, hi everyone, thanks for joining. So for a long time, my research has thought about state violence in Britain, in post-war Britain in particular, and experiences and responses to state violence and in particular state racism. So my forthcoming book, which is based on my PhD research, which is, next couple of years, looks at these subjects through the lens of care. So how the state's failure to care for, in particular, racialized citizens impacted on Black women in particular and their families. So I particularly think about questions relating to housing and council housing or public housing, policing and education and childcare, and how the state's inability to adequately provide in these domains or defend or protect and care for Black people impacted on Black women. And I think particularly about how state violence is lived and experienced, as well as the minutiae of how the state failed to care and what that included. So for instance, thinking about council housing policy in the 1970s and 80s, how allocation procedures were determined so that, for example, Black and South Asian families would end up being in some of the worst quality housing in the UK. When it comes to policing, the violence that I consider is probably far more explicit and direct, as I imagine is the case with a lot of us, thinking about raids of Black families' homes, stop and searched young men and young women, and even thinking about how Black women have their own experience of police violence that historians haven't really addressed. So, and I might come onto that in a bit, but yeah, thinking about police violence, and then finally thinking about how education serves as a form of state violence. So thinking about how the 70s and 1980s were really a time when Black children being sent into what were called at the time educationally subnormal schools or ESN schools, how they were heavily policed and scrutinized in these schools, and in fact leading to lots of collusion between the police and schools. Police were regularly invited on school grounds. Teachers would regularly provide information to police officers about children, in particular young Black children and Black teenagers. So I'm really largely concerned with how the state has really failed in its duty to care for racialized citizens in the immediate post-war period. But my kind of other strand is thinking about responses. So thinking about how Black women in particular have taken action towards state violence. And again, thinking about this through the lens of care. So thinking about educational initiatives, supplementary schools, Saturday schools, charities, organizations set upon exposing racism in British schools, but also mitigating the harm done within schools. I think about police defence campaigns carried out by Black women, particularly if they find that their family members have been unjustly arrested. For example, housing associations. So I think of my work in terms of experiences of and responses to. So I think that really kind of deals with some of the themes that have already been outlined by Gbemende, but also in terms of the broader subject around the state and its role in perpetuating the harms of enslavement and colonialism, really.
Thanks very much, Jess. I suspect Dave was going to pick up some of the themes you've just outlined about state violence as well. So, Dave?
Thanks very much for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for joining us. So my research, for about 10 years, I did research on people who die after contact with police, beginning in this country by looking at a casebook of about 64 deaths that happened over a 10 or 12-year period, and then moved on to do a research project in the United States on what was called, at that time was called police-related deaths, which was done in 2016 during the first election for Trump Mark I. And I hope to pick up parts of that later on in this discussion in terms of the evolving perspectives. And that research was conducted by interviewing the relatives of 58 people who had been shot dead by police in the United States in 16 different states. And it really came about because after finishing my project in Britain, I looked to the next obvious example, and the next obvious and most obvious example was the United States. At that time, there was a lot of discussion about the lack of data on the number of people who were killed by police in the United States, and leading to the FBI director at the time, James Comey, saying that they were embarrassed to admit that they had no idea how many people were killed by police in the United States. And that's what really pushed me to do the American project in the aftermath of the deaths of Mike Brown and Eric Garner in 2014, and led me there in 2016. And I suppose I'm leading towards ICE via George Floyd, because the book that I wrote, which came out in 2021, was written in June, July, and August in 2020. So it started the month after George Floyd was killed by a police officer. And the death of Alex Petty in Minneapolis is actually 2 miles away from where George Floyd was killed. So I draw a direct line between those two things, and I'll talk more about those in a while. But I suppose the unifying aspect, to my ear anyway, between myself and Gbemende and Jess is rights, people of colour, injustice and accountability, and that's really what I'm into. So more recently I've been looking are the deaths of people in psychiatric detention, which is in healthcare in this country, and also the deaths of people with autism and learning disabilities in health and social care. And so I see that as being justice and accountability, and again, inequalities and disproportionate levels of death amongst marginalised groups.
Thanks, Dave. That's great. I mean, you've all referenced kind of broad continuities of disadvantage and racism and unequal powers and some of the things that you've said. I wonder, and this is a question for anybody who wants to jump in. I wonder whether, because Dave, you mentioned the 2016 and the Trump, and we have George Floyd, we have these kind of key moments in history. Have you identified any kind of watersheds or discontinuities or key moments that you think in the areas that you're studying, which are more important than others? I'll leave that as an open question.
I don't mind starting if people want time to reflect. I mean, the huge watershed for us is 1999 with the Macpherson report. For those who don't know, Stephen Lawrence was a young black teenager who was stabbed to death in Brixton, in South London, in Eltham, sorry. And the police had really failed to investigate his death. In immediately after his death, lots of leads given by neighbours were dismissed by the police. The failure to follow up on leads meant that evidence was burnt, and his murderers got away for about 20, 30 years. But in 1999, after a long drawn-out campaign, Doreen Lawrence, Baroness Lawrence, kind of led that campaign, and a long inquiry resulted in this report that stated that the police in Britain were institutionally racist, or the Metropolitan Police, I should add, in London. And at that time, it was seen as a watershed. It was the first time that the state had acknowledged that there was a chronic racism issue within the police, but it hasn't been able to kind of achieve much. Policing itself is racist, as we know in the UK. Stop and search measures are still as racist as ever, and also within the police, what it seemed to have done is actually just pushed racism within the police underground, as opposed to it kind of racism being an open secret. So it's kind of labelled as this watershed, but it actually hasn't had much of an impact on policing, despite the fact that it led to kind of changes in race relations and how racism is kind of how it was decriminalised within the public sector. It hasn't really done much. That was the first date that really sprung to my mind.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Anybody?
So in thinking about that, and what came to mind with the idea of a watershed is not one particular moment, but in thinking of some of the recent protests and movements that we've seen and how they connect to, say, the civil rights movement of the 60s. And what we see now is, the rise of social media and the visibility of certain incidents with, cell phone video, doorbell video, just capturing more of some of these incidents. So, thinking about, the civil rights movement of the 60s, that's not the first attempt, of course, for African Americans to mobilize, to contest, rights violations regarding the state. But something that was slightly different was, the rise of television, where more people are seeing what's happening. And of course, there was still resistance, but, it was hard to ignore the visibility of, what was happening to individuals who were engaged in protests. That, at least calls to mind some of the more recent incidents that have gotten a lot of attention, George Floyd, of course, being one, and other incidents where, the act itself was very visible. Now, that's not, of course, the first. You can go back to Rodney King, but it does seem to the visibility connected with social media seems to serve as an important component in terms of connecting people who may feel similarly but were previously disconnected. So interestingly, the research that I mentioned earlier about race and crime, that was actually spurred by social media. it was in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin killing, where I noticed individuals on my feed, they were speaking out against, what had happened in very political ways. And it's like, oh, these individuals usually don't speak on things like this at all. And I was thinking, it seems like this has spurred something. And it's like when you see one person say something, then you may say, oh, I felt like that as well. So not one individual thing, but just thinking about the ways in which there are advances in capturing what has happened in connection with social media that can bring disparate people together. It definitely seems to allow communities to communicate, create dialogue, and pressure decision makers in a way that was maybe not impossible, but more difficult before.
Yeah, before I let Dave in, because I'm sure Dave will have something to say about that. But Jess, when you're talking about the kind of a change of institutional narrative, it was a breach when McPherson came out to say, yeah, the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist. That was a kind of a jaw-dropping moment for lots of people who had faith in policing in the UK. But Mandy, you talk, your use of and your awareness of social media and competing public narratives to challenge institutional narratives. Seems to me that this is it's that's encouraged a much more politicized debate, public debate that I don't think was there for McPherson, for example, because we didn't have public and social media. But I wonder whether you think that the kind of rise of competing public narratives on social media has led to a more politicized environment. It's kind of a yeah. No, I'll leave it there. What do you think?
That to me, Barry.
To everybody, I think. I
Yeah,
think we start with Gbemende maybe because I think that's she's in that world perhaps more than we are, Dave. And then I'll come
yeah,
back to
go ahead, please, Gbemende.
Oh, yeah, it could be. It's one of those tricky chicken versus the egg thing because you definitely have in the U.S. context, and in other societies as well, you see a degree of politicization, maybe more political division that's there. So what can happen if you see these really salient images and you already have perhaps an environment where there's polarization, there is maybe an immediate reaction to frame what is shown in a way that corresponds with what you already believe. So that's why you can have two people looking at the same video and saying, well, no, that person was at fault, or the other person could be at fault as well. So it can be those competing narratives in the aftermath of, really visible events can be a reflection of what is already there. However, if perhaps the event itself, whatever's depicted, may seem to challenge maybe beliefs or feelings that you didn't even know were present, but were made salient by the event, then you can have subsequent, divisive opinions rise to the surface. So just I could see it going multiple ways, but if you have an environment that's already polarized, then you will get those competing arguments about, okay, who was at fault? Maybe the person shouldn't even been there, X, Y, and Z, things like that.
that's interesting. Dave?
Yeah, I'll pick up on Gbemende because I completely agree with the social media and camera phones and the politicisation, certainly in relation to the research I did. So I think I'm right in saying, and Gbemende will correct me if otherwise, but it was Black Lives Matter took off after Trayvon Martin was killed. It really exploded on Twitter as it was then. And then it got a further massive boost after the summer of 2014 with the killings of Eric Garner and Mike Brown by the police. So I think that's true, but I also think there's been more continuity than there has been change because the protests that came up after Ferguson, which went on for a very long time with a lot of people on the ground, not dissimilar to Minneapolis now, was still met by overwhelming force of militarized police, SWAT units, tear gas, flashbang grenades, and so forth. All of that was screened, daily, nightly into the news all over the world. And it didn't stop. That response just carried on until the protests stop. So I think it's a bit of both, and I would say that in the work that I do, I came across and continue to come across people working in advocacy groups and activist groups who will say, they'll quote a name and they'll say 1989, 1994, 2016, 2013, and every time it's going to be the last time, and every time enough is enough, and every time we're not going to put up with this anymore. And that's all completely understandable. When I was writing the book after George Floyd died, I kept a handwritten diary, which I've never done in my life before, to document what was going on every day in the news. And you could see after a few weeks, it was tailing off, it was dying out, the news cycle had changed. There was that huge outrage. But I think my point would be these aren't individual events, they're part of wider systemic policing, right? Which is for all of the individual cases that get highlighted, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds every year that don't get highlighted. And it's not uncommon, and I heard it certainly when I was on the ground doing my research. People talk about the areas they live in as war zones. They talk about them as being feeling like they're under military occupation. Well, that's so you may have major individual one-off events that generate massive media coverage, wider systemic issues. And I think you could see that with ICE, in Minneapolis, they take a playbook of militarized policing and run with
it. Jen, here.
I am interested in this question around visibility, because although in the book that I'm ostensibly race, violent crime had been rising since because of a whole host of issues facing crisis by Stuart Hall. The apparent rise in violent crime was picked up in the press and labelled as mugging. So they imported the term mugging from the States, but it gave the impression in the media that this was a new crime, an imported crime, and people should be scared. And so the press kept on reporting on mugging as if it was a new crime and making it more and more visible, making people more and more scared about it, and therefore legitimizing kind of really punitive policing tactics, in particular stop and search. So the question around visibility, I think it's always rendered visible and highly visible just over the time in different mediums, and particularly, the press and the media being really responsible for making certain crime particularly visible.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think the idea of engendering crisis as a way of empowering the state to take particular form of actions that it wants to do. I wonder if there's anything to say about the particular racial quality of crisis that is being portrayed. You talked, Dave, about the feeling of the war on crime. We've had the war on drugs. We've had the mugging crisis in the UK. It may be that there are different contexts in different sides of the Atlantic, but it seems to me that you can only I'm one of the speakers, I'm a commentator, so you guys know, but it seems to me you can only engender a feeling of crisis that then has to be solved by the state if it keys directly into long-standing, deeply embedded prejudices and racial politics. So I don't know what your thoughts, whether anyone's got any thoughts on that, or if anybody wants to make any comment about the particular crisis that appears to be happening in the States at the moment.
I'd say something about states of emergency. It was living and working in the US for 6 months in 2016. It had never occurred to me that states of emergency would be invoked so often. So I was based in North Carolina, but I was moving around to different states doing interviews. emergency in North Carolina. I think about that from a British perspective. I can't, in my life, and I'm nearly 60, ever remember a curfew being called, and that includes through our campaign, a strike, where you would think, well, if there was going to be a strike, but it didn't. But it's almost an extension of this, the multiple wars: war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on immigrants. Well, then you are going to have states of exception. Gambin says you're going to call states of emergency. It's not a coincidence that the United States has got a long history of calling the army in to quell uprisings in Watts or in Detroit, or there are any number of places it's been done, Los Angeles. And again, you can see this now with ICE in Minneapolis effectively operating as a domestic army. And I think it's difficult to get away from that. It's difficult to get away from the fact, as Zygmunt Bauman said, that the US has got the largest defense arms budget in the world. Well, Bauman says, well, I wouldn't have that if they didn't use it, would they? What would be the point of spending that money without using it? And I think there's a book called Schrader called Badges Without Borders, where he talks about how counter operations run by the United States informs policing and domestic security in the US is very compelling, and I thought about that with the Venezuela. Anyway, I'll talk too much. Somebody else should talk.
Anybody pick up on that? I just got to come to make enemies within used to be class enemies. That's how they're portrayed, as class. That was the issue, and occasionally it's kind of religion a little bit, but now it seems predominantly to be about race. The enemy within is the globalized majority, and I wonder whether that is a shift in political tactics, or a shift in sensibilities, or just in late modernity that's caused that.
Can I add something, or just related to crisis? Like, I feel at the moment, I was just driving home thinking, like, there are two prominent crises going on at the moment: the ICE crisis and the Epstein one. And the Epstein, they kind of juxtapose in that. Well, I think of the Epstein crisis is a racialized one, but it's one about the powerful white elite and how the kind of the policing has happened with that, and that it's failed to really police these men, majority men, does say things the way that so not police is racialized. And it doesn't just mean racialized in the character of referring to people who have been racialized as black or brown, but those racialized as white are also involved in the kind of the web of crime and criminality. But some crises that seem to catastrophic than others.
That's the point. Dave?
Yeah, I'll just speak briefly. And something you said made me think of, something we've spoken about before briefly, in terms of like the thinking about race and crime today and some of its origins, and thinking about like Black codes, after enslavement, these codes that, restricted or at least policed, movement and activity that would not seem criminal, and how those formally, but the legacies of those can endure, where certain actions being in certain places, maybe responding in certain ways, can then escalate to a conflict matter of the state. So maybe start of the interaction would not fit the definition of criminality, but because of some of those legacies of restricted behavior or expectations of where one is supposed to be, you see them kind of develop into that. So where it can occur in situations where you least expect something that seemed like a mundane interaction then becomes something more dramatic, unfortunately.
Yeah, very good point. I'm thinking about some of the aims of this seminar series and some of the things that, like the documentary film you were in, Gbemende starred in, I should say, were about public engagement. Find a way of publicly engaging the public or a wider public or non-academic in these kinds of debates. Any of the three of you could say a little something about attempts that you've made or would like to make to take these debates outside of the academy? You've already done your bit, Bemende, in the film, which was actually premiered over here in one of our in Liverpool's arts cinema to a big public audience as well. So you've had a little bit of experience of that. But I'm think we're constantly feeling the responsibility now to kind of engage in public debate. We might do that on social media, or we might do that in media pieces that we do. But I wonder whether how maybe Jess, you could talk about public history or something,
Yeah,
how you've attempted to do that.
I struggle. I really struggle. I do a lot with schools. I do a lot with young people, particularly in secondary school level. I've been to schools and I've tried to teach them critical reading skills when it comes to looking at press reports. So a typical one that I used to do was thinking about 1976 Carnival, which broke out in violence between police officers and carnivalists, and the way it was reported at the time. And I done this session quite a few times with students that have been looking at photographs and without any captions, them think, well, what do you think is taking place here? And they'll often think, oh, a police officer might be helping this young black child escape or get, kind of come away from the crime or sorry, the kind of the disturbance, or two young black women running through the street, for example. What do you think is going on? Or maybe they're fleeing something, and then showing the way the media works. But occasionally I find that with it is challenging material that we're looking at, and stories of police brutality and events. We had an event in Dublin about how to do public engagement with stuff which is inherently quite violent, and it's still something that I'm kind of working with and on. And I think it's important to do this work with teenagers, but I think there needs to be greater training on the most effective ways to do this, which I think there isn't a great amount of guidance within institutional settings in the UK, I think.
Interesting. Dave?
I found that the media was much more interested in my research into police deaths in America, because I think it feeds into the peculiar British view that we don't have any problems, but the Americans have lots of problems, which is certainly not my view. My view is that there are actually very similar issues that lead to deaths after police contact. So in the American research, I gave a talk on BBC Radio 4, which is a monologue to a program called Forethought, which was about America as defined by the idea of exceptionalism, and that police-related deaths were a version of that. And wrote a long opinion op-ed piece for the New Statesman, which is a sort of centre-left weekly magazine here in the UK, called 5 Years After Ferguson, which looked at the long tail of these deaths in the United States. And I found in both of those cases I got quite a lot of abuse via email, because I've never gone on social media, because it's opening the floodgates to all sorts of people to attack me. But I do have a publicly accessible email address on the university website. So I had all sorts of interesting emails, including some death threats, and I took them and I used them in a teaching session that year to ask students what they thought, what motivated people to write this sort of threats, aggressive statements, and how could I have blood on my hands given that I'd not actually killed anybody, for example. So I suppose that echoes a bit what Jess was talking about. How do you talk about these things? But also in this country, I did a lot of public talks actually when my first book came out. In a forum called people in America will laugh at this, called Skeptics in the Pub, which is a national affiliation of organisations who have talks in pubs once a month. And I went round, I can't remember, 8, 10 different cities doing that. And that was very interesting to see how people reacted, who had experience of policing, who had experience of mental health care, mental ill health, injustice, coroners, death investigations. It was fascinating to see how people reacted to talks and things they picked up and discussed, and in some cases argued quite loudly with each other in those sessions. So I think it's important to get out there, but I also think Jess is right that you've got to be careful and you've got to be safe as well.
Mm. Do you, with your work on, care settings, do you find that the authorities you work with are more resistant than the police or not?
I don't think they're any more resistant, but I don't think they're any more helpful either. And that's not saying much, let's face it.
No, I just imagine that there's quite a lot of resistance to academics coming in and doing that kind of work. So the healthcare environment is a very closed,
Yeah,
formalized space, isn't it? So just
yeah,
thinking about how we engage, Jess has talked about co-production in the past and working with schools, and I'm thinking about the onus on us to publicly engage and work. It's also, I think, a responsibility to work with institutions to help them to change if they're willing to do so as well. But that must be very difficult. Don't know whether Gbemende or Jess have any experience of working with institutions.
Well, so a couple of years ago, I was a part of an organization, or this was in upstate New York, where it was a coalition of professors from multiple schools, um, individuals who were part of the legal community, so like lawyers, former law enforcement, and its students. And let's see, the goal of this, and then just in the aftermath of George Floyd, was to come together and create a dialogue about what happened, and it involved multiple components. It was a course component, so students were writing about best practices, webinars where people were speaking on like mental health concerns. And also a survey, which I was excited to be a part of the local community to see how they felt about safety in their community and things like that. But a part of it involved, academics dialoguing with, practitioners. And so that involved people working in mental health and law enforcement directly. And I think it's what's really important in those relationships is, even if they're going to be temporary, is can you establish a degree of trust? I think maybe one concern, what are you going to say? Where are you going Um, I think with that coalition, it occurred. I can't remember how many months it was, but it was over a longer period. So I think that helped, people communicate, maybe form relationships. But it's still going to perhaps involve concern that do you understand my perspective versus your perspective? And, do I have the opportunity to be heard? And that's kind of what with any coalition types of occupation. So I did have that experience a couple of years ago, and I feel like it progressed in a positive way the longer people get to engage with each other. I don't know if you've heard of the phrase like storming and norming, where maybe initially when there's an attempt to, this is from it's from a discipline. I'm trying to remember which one, but basically when you bring like a new group together, there can be a stormy period because I don't know you, you don't know me. We're trying to figure out things out, and sometimes the storm can be so tricky that it falls apart. But that can actually be a normal part of period. Okay. I kind of see how things are. So I just say that to say I've seen that in this type of work when you're trying to build dialogues across occupations. And I think what's key is a willingness to kind of ride out that. But it also, there needs to be respect to all the individuals involved. Because if there's not, then I do think it may make sense for parties to disengage. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it definitely helps, and definitely a phrase I'm going to be adopting as well, storming and norming. That sounds fantastic.